Eric?
He's right there.
Oh.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alicia Swami. I'm here with my co-hosts Keely Severson and Eric Johnson, and we are exposing mold. Today, we are going to talk about mold illness. Is it or is it not dose dependent, Eric or Keely?
Well, if you accept that these microparticles are transported in nanoparticle form and can travel up the olfactory nerve and prime the microglia directly through stimulating the brain, then of course not. There's no way. There's a certain portion of it, the toxin from the mycotoxins from the mold will build up in your body and exert an influence that is dose related at some point, obviously. But if there's an aspect of this that is an entirely separate mechanism, and that mechanism bypasses considerations of dose dependency, then no, the microglia can be primed directly in a way that means that dosage doesn't matter. Just the impact, how much of this gets in your nose and goes up the olfactory nerve is going to dictate what kind of response.
Eric, I think what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is maybe in a situation of cancer or organ failure where you're suspecting mycotoxicoses as the cause, it takes a specific dose to get to that point. But with mold hypersensitivity and our hypersensitive reactions, our reactions aren't necessarily dose dependent, because you could have a very serious reaction that feels like you're going to die or that puts you in bed for a month with just a tiny bit of exposure.
Exactly. So
And
there's
so
been
you're kind of
studies of
differentiating here what would be hypersensitivity. You would say is absolutely not dose dependent. It's an immune system response that's not dose dependent, whereas some other aspects of mold related illness may be.
Yeah, there have been studies in Africa that show that the high levels of mycotoxins in the grains are associated with certain cancers and immune dysfunctions. So clearly, there is a dose-dependent mycotoxin type illness, but is it possible that people have been focusing on that to an extent that it derailed interest in the clues that suggest that there's a sudden impact kind of illness that is not dose dependent? And I believe that's what's happened. I think that in certain situations where the Stachybotrys was so bad and people walked in and got sick very quickly shows that there is something entirely different, so overwhelming. And of course, you could just pass this off by saying, well, that was just a really, really bad high-level exposure. Maybe, and maybe not. What would the clues be that show that there's a different mechanism that needs to be explored? And I believe that what we've learned about nanoparticles traveling up the olfactory nerve suggests that there is a hidden super toxic exposure event that is not dose dependent, that is being hidden by the focus on trying to turn this into, well, you've got this amount of ochratoxin A, or you've got this level of zearalenone or deoxynivalenol. And the focus on this is so extreme that it's overshadowed the way people can get a sudden impact type of illness, which is commonly described with barometric pressure change. There are so many people that talk about the change in the weather, and something happened with the mold where in a very short period of time, an exposure puts them over the edge and they relapse for long periods of time. So that's where I talked about bioavailability. What is it about barometric pressure change, or a change in the weather that makes things bioavailable in a certain way that is so spectacular that it's obviously not a dose-dependent type of illness.
Eric, how would you answer somebody who asks the question of why do all of my family members have different symptoms or different ranges of illness with nobody really being as sick as I am? In relation to dosage.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on that?
Just look at what happens in sick buildings. Just look at the people in there, how people in certain rooms become ill while people on the other side of the building do not. So there's a certain amount of exposure, dosage related, that comes into play here. And then there's the people that got too close to a colony who get that sudden impact kind of illness, where maybe they were just the workmen who came to clean up the mold and they got a massive slam that knocked them out. So you've got that variable that seemed to prime their immune system and put them over the edge. And then there's the viral factor, where people get some kind of Epstein-Barr virus reactivation, cytomegalovirus, HHV6, some concurrent viral exposure that causes a cytokine cascade that could act as a priming event. And that's what we seem to see in the original chronic fatigue syndrome cluster, where people were going along, maintaining with the exposure that was going on, the chemicals and the toxic mold, and then a virus came through, and that's what put them down for the count. So they acquired a hypersensitivity of chronic type of illness, which people in the very next room did not have. And so the psychologizers and the doctors say, well, not everybody in the building got sick, so therefore it's either non-existent or something wrong with you. Maybe not. Maybe something was so bad in the colonies that they were directly exposed to that it was a threshold event that put them over the edge. So that's how I explain it to people who say, well, only one person or one or two in the family are getting sick. Well, maybe they didn't have the virus. Maybe they didn't have a mycoplasma infection. Maybe they didn't have some kind of, Marcons, which Dr. Shoemaker's been talking about. But just because not everybody has the equal illness in that room or in that building is not sufficient reason to put the blame back on some personal deficiency, a genetic flaw, emotional stress, or something peculiar to them. It could very well be that they were just in a bad place at a bad time and got an overwhelming confluence of events that drove them into hypersensitivity.
I also suspect and observe that when people make this statement, I was the only one that was sick in my house, or me and my one son and no one else was sick, just because everyone doesn't have the exact same illness presentation or the same category of symptoms does not mean that everyone's not sick. And I think sometimes people could have illness presentations that aren't commonly thought of as mold illness, and so it goes under the radar. Personality changes, things that are classified as mental health, recurrent infections, things that are diagnosed as other things. The milk goblin's dying. Sorry, that noise was so distracting. It seems like often when people ask that question, why am I the only one that's sick? They're not actually the only one that's sick, but other people might have symptoms that are different. That could be strong personality changes or something less commonly associated with mold illness. So sometimes the question isn't even true as an honest question at its basis, is what I'm trying to say.
Gaslighting. That's right. They're trying to discount the fact of your illness by saying that everybody else must surely have it or it's all in your head.
Oh, and the genetic factor. People could then gaslight you into saying, well, you're so sick and you're at your level because you have bad genes. You're just a weak person. It's crazy.
Yeah, when I first got interested in the sick building phenomenon, it was such a localized event that I could stand at a distance out of the bad zone and observe people going in, supposedly healthy people, teachers, teenagers, strong, healthy kids, and watch them for any change in their behavior or physical manifestation that they sense something bad. And I saw it big time. I mean, they would yawn, they'd move into a protective stance, or some people would just outright turn around and run. And I proposed to people studying sick building syndrome, if you just put up a camera, you can see it in people. You can see it. It's not difficult. But they didn't want to do that.
I've definitely noticed really big personality changes upon exposure in people who don't consider themselves mold sick or don't consider themselves sensitized. So I guess just adding to your observation is this affects people even when they don't realize that they've been affected, or even if others don't observe them as affected. Once you see this, you kind of see it everywhere, literally everywhere.
Dr. Shoemaker actually did a study where he wondered if the supposedly healthy people in sick buildings were truly invulnerable as they thought. So he looked at their inflammatory markers and found no, they simply hadn't hit the wall yet. That's all it was.
Yeah, it brings me back to like the whole CFS incident when they did the testing on people who, had the titers and had these overt symptoms, but they also tested the immune systems of those who had no symptoms, and they still showed some sort of immune system failure. And so it's like symptoms don't mean that it's not just about symptom presentation, meaning that you're sick. You can have literally no symptoms and this is still affecting you. And I think we always say this, but I think we need to reiterate the point that poison is poison. There's no one that is shielded or is superior in genetic bloodline when it comes to being exposed to poison. Not even our animals are safe.
But getting back to the point about is this a dose dependent illness? If you inhale something toxic, it takes a certain amount of time for that effect to translate into the heart acting weird, move through the blood and into the brain. And so I would hold my breath and go into a stachybotrys situation and then take a breath. And the reaction seemed to occur so quickly that it was prior to the amount of time it would take for the toxin to get through the blood and into the brain. So that suggested to me that it was the mechanism of traveling up the olfactory nerve being sensed neurologically in a manner that is not dose dependent, but strictly instantaneous toxic threat to the nervous system. And in a way, when I talk about the rebreathing effect, that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm looking for. I walk into a place and then I start looking for a change in how what I'm inhaling affects me. And when I get that instant response where it appears that something that I am processing by the very nature of stripping oxygen out of the air somehow unleashes this effect, and it occurs so quickly that it takes place faster than a dose related response ought to take. That's my sign that I am in a truly bad environment, and that's when I know to turn around and run. I believe that the reason I'm doing as well as I am, and I've managed to take control of this illness in the way that I have, is by singling out this particular subset, this specific effect. That's why I call it the Eric Johnson effect. This effect stands out from a conceptualization of this as a dose-related illness. Did I make any sense?
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is the effect doesn't depend on a dosage. Like a big dosage or a small dosage can both produce the same effect. And so it doesn't really give a clue about the level of exposure, just maybe the route of exposure.
Yeah, Dr. Martin Paul talked about this with the vanilloid receptors in the nose. And vanilloid because these receptors are very sensitive to vanilla. So it was very useful to be able to detect extremely low levels of molecules by testing, I guess, vanilla. And these receptors have a direct connection to the brain up the olfactory nerve, direct. And people, in his view, were sensing chemical exposures, not just mycotoxins, but chemical exposures and transmitting this information directly through the vanilloid receptors up the olfactory nerve to the microglia in the brain. So it's very possible that we have sensing mechanisms that tell us, that give us useful information about many types of chemical exposures. And it's instant and it's not dose related. But I singled out the one with the Stachybotrys with the mycotoxins because that was my particular irritant and that's my field of interest. But I don't want to limit it to just that when this probably applies to other chemicals as well. My grandfather told me kind of a funny story. The rotten egg smell in natural gas, when natural gas was first introduced, it didn't have that. There was no warning, so you couldn't tell if you had a leak. And of course, all these pipes were going bad and people would have horrible leaks that wouldn't show up until a flame got too close to a leak. And buildings all over San Francisco were blowing up. Huge, terrible explosions. And they finally introduced the methyl mercaptans, which is a sensitizing agent. And what makes it so useful is that it's perceptible at a few parts per million, extremely super low levels, and you can tell the rotten egg odor. And it's a sensitizing agent, and that's what it's used for because it sensitizes the nerves. And when they introduced this into the natural gas, people all over San Francisco were complaining that this rotten egg thing that they put into it must be damaging the pipes because all of a sudden they can smell natural gas where they never could smell it before. Well, they were just detecting leaks for the first time. And that's kind of the view that I have of what's going on with the mycotoxins, that they were probably always around, that they didn't really change as dramatically as people think, but a sensitizing agent made them bioavailable to us, made them more apparent, sensitized the nerves.
So that would make the problem the sensitization of the nerves more so than the dose, because that's what allowed it to be bioavailable, whereas before they weren't bioavailable, causing the same type of problems.
Yeah, and one has to wonder if this methyl mercaptans is such a powerful sensitizing agent to introduce it on such a large scale. What's this going to do to people over the long run? We weren't evolutionarily exposed to this stuff. And now we've got constant low levels of a sensitizing agent in our environment. So what's that doing? Is that opening us up to other stuff? I don't know.
So are you saying what they put in the gas to make it detectable could have possibly opened us up to something else?
Sure, because it's a low level inflammatory irritant.
God, I wish all this stuff was documented so we could see the progression.
So did we just make an argument for toxic soup?
Oh boy.
Well, our human life is constant exposure to multiple things. So science is directed to trying to narrow in, refine our view such that we can isolate certain variables and control them as much as possible. You can't write things off as toxic soup, because then you'll never isolate those variables and you'll never control them. And that was my issue with Dr. Shoemaker and the direction he moved with SIRS. It started out narrow enough that he was focused on Stachybotrys and he was looking at the blue-green algae. And this is a manageable data set. Few enough factors that we can find out, are these changing? What are they doing? Can we move away from them? But once you go down the path of going, well, this is just the sum total of anything and everything, then you can't do anything about any of them. If you go into a Shoemaker doctor now, and well, SIRS is the result of everything from ciguatoxin to brown recluse spiders. Well, what are you supposed to do if you have no brown recluse spiders in your environment? How's buying a high-tech air filter going to filter out the brown recluse spiders? I don't have much use for that kind of toxic mentality. I want to know what it is in my environment that changed, that didn't used to be there, that's making me and others sick now in a way that didn't previously used to happen.
So basically, any healthcare provider that's saying something like, well, of course you're not going to be healthy in this increasingly toxic world, you should probably run.
Well, I'm sure they're correct. There's enough truth in that statement that it's valid to make that assertion, but it has very little practical value.
I feel like people say that in relation to saying like everything is dangerous and you can't say just one thing is the most dangerous.
And they're getting worse and worse and worse until they want to outlaw all perfumes. I mean, every chemical, and society is not going to tolerate that. They're not going to assist in that project. I think the mold community has done themselves a huge disservice by adding to their list of toxic molds that now go so far as to claim that any mold, any bacteria, any water damage is something that you should be afraid of. Can't live that way.
Which is what people think that we are doing when we recommend mold avoidance. It's funny how that's actually not what we're doing, but people think we are, and then the people who do it, people don't think are doing that.
Yeah, when this backlash against mold avoidance first manifested in the sick buildings group back in 2000, I was describing how by simply getting clear in the desert, I was unmasking and better able to narrow down specifically what I was reacting to when I went back into civilization. And somehow that got twisted around to mean that Eric is living in the desert in a tent with only rattlesnakes and scorpions for company, and he wants everybody else to live the same way. I'm going, no, I'm not. You look where I'm at. Yes, I do spend a lot of time in the desert as an experiment to help me refine this concept, but that's not how I plan to live out my life. And that's not what mold avoidance is all about. So when people said, no, I don't care if you've got a picture of a house behind you, you're still living in the tent in the desert. And I'm going, that if that's how you want to be, then call it the godforsaken desert. And if you want to weed yourself out and deprive yourself of knowing about this strategy, more power to you.
Well, the people that try to take you down are just people with profit motives to sell their bullshit air purifiers and filtration systems and their clairvoyance conversations. I don't know, what is that mold expert that's scheduling free clarification conversations or something? Like, how stupid are you? Like, if something is working, you should be elevating that and helping people with that and help them get to that point where they can, I mean, you don't have to live in the tent in the desert. The desert experiment is just for you to understand your symptoms in relation to your surroundings and contaminated items and such. I mean, it's just refining your senses to understand, all right, when I have these feelings in buildings or things, then that means that I'm in the presence of contamination. I'm in the presence of a moldy building. I need to leave. I mean, literally, that's what it is. So
I
it's
think
just
it's a I think it's a confusing and new idea for people to think in terms of being able to feel something inside of their body that is externally from them communicating with their internal being. So the idea of sensing something in your environment and it communicating with your body to give you information and then using that as a skill, I feel like is a very confusing idea to people.
Well, we don't have any mental framework that allows us to grasp the existence of something acting in that way. We kind of do, like electricity or heat. We know there are things out there that emanate from a source point and we can feel it. But applying this to mold, microbial colonies, no, that's unfamiliar. And I think the reason for that is because this was very low level in the past, not non-existent. There's sufficient descriptions of it to go, yeah, there's something to this. But sometime in the 1980s, it went through the roof. And something about microbial colonies having a range to them and affecting people at a distance. That's when these complaints really started to take off like a rocket, where one person in the house would get sick and you would find out, well, they were sleeping right next to the wall with the toxic mold. The rest of the family wasn't.
So then in that case, would that be dose dependent or not? Or proximity dependent, because the proximity is what allowed it to become bioavailable through the
Well, it
exposure.
sure looked that way. It looked that way so strongly that created a satisfactory explanation, so you don't need to look any further. Okay, you got too close to the colony, you got a higher dose. There it is. But that didn't hold up. We didn't find super high doses in these people. And then there were those who would just go into an environment and become ill very quickly. Or the people that move in and out of a range of a colony and can feel it. These exceptions didn't really jibe with dose dependency, because if you move 2 or 3 feet, you're probably not changing your dose all that much. Yet to a hypersensitive person, it makes all the difference in the world. So you need to really focus on that exception and how that doesn't fit the dose-dependent model before you even take interest in the effect to know to look for it.
You got that?
Yeah.
I think this is going to be a tough one for people to understand because it is pretty confusing. Hopefully this conversation provides clarification.
There was an incident down in South America that I like to use for an example, where a hospital was abandoned and all the equipment was just left in place. And people looted the hospital and took what they could. Anyway, these kids started showing up and they had burns on their fingers. Burns, I mean, physical, like they had grabbed something red hot. And it drove people crazy. And observation of these kids, they were playing with marbles, glass marbles, and you get the big steely, and that's all part of the game. And these kids, it showed up with the marbles often enough that some adults took notice of this, took the marbles away from the kids, and got burns themselves from handling these marbles. One guy actually put them in his pocket and he had burns on his legs from marbles. Okay, that's just crazy. That's impossible. Well, they use radioactive elements in these hospitals for their chemotherapy, and they're in the form of marbles, like the Steelies played in the game of marbles. And when they looted these hospitals, so these highly radioactive marbles were being passed around and kids were playing with them. And that's where they got the burns from. And they finally worked out that this is what was happening. But what was amazing is that from a conceptual framework of a marble being just a sphere of some fairly harmless substance, either steel or glass, you would never conceive of anything like this happening. You'd never figure it out. You'd have to know about radiation. And it was only the people to go, what on earth could burn somebody that way, a radiation burn? They were able to work out this puzzle. And then they went out there with Geiger counters and found that even the place where these marbles had been transported left a trail of radiation. They were that bad. So the question here is, if you encounter something that doesn't fit your conceptual framework, you've got a choice to make. You can go, well, that doesn't make any sense, and not look any further. Or I better look into this because it's happening and it makes no sense according to what I know.
Okay, so you just made me realize some of the, I'm not going to say that. We'll edit that out. Nothing.
Well, your experience with the oven was like that.
Well, what I was going to compare it to was mast cell symptoms, which we already explained as something else, basically bacteria kind of eating away at your face.
Well, what stimulates the mast cells to degranulate? Probably any threat that the cell perceives as a danger signal, as a damage or danger signal. If it gets to a point where it's threatening the life and health of the cell, what's the cell going to do? Protect itself. What's the mechanism it uses? Mast cell degranulation.
So what does that mean?
It means you get jacked up and whenever something tries to harm the body.
Bodies is pretty efficient at letting us know things are harmful, but I feel like our bodies are just not made for this type of, I don't know, microbiome, this type of setting that we're in. It's like all these mechanisms are self-protective, but I mean, they're debilitating at the same time.
Well, we see people trying to fit something extremely abnormal into a standard conceptual framework, and it's not working out.
I wonder, like, what's going to be the catalyst to get people to be on board with all this stuff? Like, are they just going to bury it in, disease names and all this other stuff? It's just like, at what point do you stop just throwing disease names out there and you really are trying to figure out why these are happening?
Well, if you read Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it turns out that paradigms rarely collapse due to their own failure. It's not the inadequacy that causes the abandonment of a flawed way of looking at something. A new, better way has to be presented. So if somebody can come up with an explanation that makes sense, that's where you get your foot in the door and people start to listen to it.
You have explanations that make sense. It's just, how do we get people to believe them? The right people to believe them. Do they want to believe them? Do they want to look into it? It's like
I feel like we just have to keep talking about it because Eric isn't allowed to talk about his own ideas for some reason. But if we talk about them, people are like, Eric is so brilliant. If he talks about them, they're like, who do you think you are having an idea?
These ideas are awesome, but then like there's another battle going on within our own little cohort of like mold sensitive people, where you have these other people trying to position themselves as experts and then out explain basically your findings into something that makes more sense to people. I don't know, but then it kind of derails the whole process that you've built for the last 35 years, Eric, of like, okay, these are things that make sense and they all match, and I'm putting these puzzle pieces together. And then you have this little, opportunist taking it away or whatever, taking all of your teachings and then twisting it the way that they want to twist it, the way that makes sense to them, but they don't have the scientific puzzle pieces put together. And
They
then
twist
people
it
go and
so
follow
much.
that. Yeah. And then people go and follow them, and then they're following this person, then they get screwed over, and then they come back to Eric, and then it's like, wow, Eric was right all along. I should have just listened to him and reduced all this damage that I've done to myself in my life. It's crazy. Like, people are their own worst enemy, I feel like, at the end of the day. Like, you're just trying to fight against like all of this crazy information and all of it being skewed, and we're just trying to find a uniting point here where we can work together and move forward with this information.
Well, as Kuhn said, paradigm shifts are always accomplished by a clash of ideas. And it has to be extremely confrontational, or the paradigm shift never happens.
All right. Well,
All right, we're right on check for that.
Extremely
Extremely confrontational. Check.
I don't know. Maybe we need to get more confrontational. When we have tried to get a little bit more confrontational, it did seem to turn on a switch there,
Well,
especially within these mold groups.
it's like the guy that got burned from the marbles in his pocket. He started going to doctors, going, no, wait, really? I mean, seriously. They were, no, you're crazy. And he couldn't back down because he was telling the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's just what we have to do, is just never back down and keep pushing forward. Like, this information needs to keep moving beyond us, beyond our lifespans. It's like,
If you look at history,
Going-
every paradigm shift has always happened this way. Anytime there was a new idea, it was very confrontational, and there was a lot of argument and a lot of unhappiness. But as Thomas Kuhn describes, that's how it has to be.
So maybe we're right on track.
Yeah, in a weird kind of way, the fact that we create such anger and hostility, that shows we're on the right track.
Well, it's not very much fun being on the right track.
No. Especially when you're not getting paid for it.
2023. I'm going to be a golf pro. I mean, eventually it's going to happen. It's just, yeah, I mean, with any new idea, you're met with so much resistance until everyone is on board with you. I just feel like it's like that. We're at that cusp, we're hitting that catalyst. So, do you guys have anything else you want to say?
Well, I still think we need to get a moldy OnlyFans channel going. We have, pornography putting out the mold ideas at the same time, so it can sneak in and people don't realize they're being brainwashed.
Okay, but Eric, what
That is
content are you going to contribute to our moldy fans?
His chest hair.
Oh, yeah, right.
Alicia, are you going to be there to do some recording?
My husband will kill me.
Pornographers rule the world. They really do.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the money's at. Good Lord. Sad. I mean, people will pay money for like photos of your feet. That's how weird.
I was literally just thinking of like a fungus foot fetish.
There you go.
That's Eric. He's got the fungal feet.
You literally were reading my my mind. I'm like, well, if we had a website for people who had foot fetish with toenail fungus, we could sell pictures of Eric's feet. And the fact that we all know about Eric's feet is like, we're too close at this point. Now everyone knows that Eric has foot fungus.
Yeah, I'm gonna edit this out. I don't want the moldy fans to get out because someone's gonna take it and run with it. And pretty soon we'll see Moldy OnlyFans LLC.
And they'll make
24
$50
to
million.
84% of
I
homes.
literally think we have an exposing mold OnlyFans account.
What?
Yeah, because I made one a while ago.
Really?
Yeah, but Moldy Fans is a better name. We should remake it with Moldy Fans.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Moldy
you can change the
OnlyFans.
name, but I don't know what we'd actually post on it because I wouldn't literally post porn.
I mean, okay, this is what we can do. We can make our educational videos and just put some cleavage in the shot and there you go. You know, like just wear a good bra and just put the boobs out there and, you know, let them bounce a little bit.
It's like I said, if you were to wear a tank top and just say that you're not wearing anything, that would be enough.
I had a freaking tube top on that lady's like, is she wearing anything? If anything, I got hatred from that, not more likes.
Not from dudes though.
It's like, is this lady wearing anything? I know that's
So
the way
we
it
should be.
I mean, we mostly cater to women. That's our main.
I feel like
audience.
OnlyFans isn't just porn though. Like some people actually sell classes and stuff.
Yeah,
like other kinds of subscriptions. So like I
It's
didn't
the only
make
way
it with
I've
a
heard
porn
about it.
intention. What, Eric?
That's the only way I've heard. I thought it was just porn.
I think that's the most popular use and
Yeah.
it definitely has that reputation, but there are people who have like other subscriptions on OnlyFans that are like education related and stuff.
Oh,
But
Yeah.
you know, I think we could have a real niche for like mold rage porno. That might really turn some people on.
What, showing
well,
people
anyway,
yelling at each other?
I do see
I love how Eric's like, anyway.
complaints in mold groups that people are affected in ways that the experts don't understand. And I think there's sort of a silent majority that they don't want to talk about it because it's so weird.
Because
So
why?
if we can provide a logical explanation, we'll attract those people and they'll want to hear what we have to say.
And those are the only people that we want to attract anyways, because we don't want to attract people that we have to fight with to convince. We just want to attract people who are looking for the explanation to make sense of their symptoms because they're sick and confused and they know they're missing a piece, like how we all felt.
Sure.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the rest can go F off and die. Tired of these people, man. I get so annoyed. You know, I have so much peace in my life now that I've unfollowed Brian's groups. I'm like, oh, Zen. I don't see any of his stupid
He
shit.
was so
anymore.
triggering to you.
Oh my God. I just feel like he is just like a skeezy opportunist. Like, oh, crypto. Oh, now he's a crypto expert. Oh, mold. Oh, now he's a mold avoidance expert. And like, how are you literally going to build a platform and never think to collaborate with the actual person that you're pulling ideas from? Like, that was Eric's first time on Brian's platform was when we like made a huge fuss over it to like get him on there. Like, that's where I'm like, I don't like people who like are intentionally snaky for their own benefit.
Well, to his credit, he constantly says, listen to Eric, talk to Eric, but people don't do it.
I don't know. I just feel like he needs to be put in his place. And I just can't wait for the day where I can just, I don't know what I'm going to do, but something will happen. I'm just annoyed. Like, why hasn't he like elevated your work and, you know, maybe progressed this with his own influence over people and has tried to pull researchers to look and, you know, like, why hasn't he helped
I
you?
feel like you're annoyed because he used it for his own benefit instead of like trying to help Eric with it or like circling back. Like that
Yeah.
he just like monetized it and made it something that kind of benefited him that he put himself the head of. I think
Yeah.
there's something that triggers you.
Well, that's exactly how I feel about Dr. Neil Nathan.
Absolutely.
Why didn't Nathan go to the Open Medicine Foundation and say, I'm the chronic fatigue syndrome specialist, and I'm finding this is a mold problem?
Mm-hmm.
It's only a few miles away.
Yeah. That, and then now you're an energy vampire. Oh, good Lord. How did you go from point A to point B? Like,
Are we
right
still recording?
Yeah. Let me stop
And
it.
he admitted that he and his wife are both affected by these energy vampires, such that momentary exposure will